The quiet streets of Greenwood Hills were lined with oak trees, their branches swaying gently in the summer breeze. The houses, each meticulously maintained, had neat, well-manicured lawns, picket fences, and driveways with SUVs parked in front. It was the kind of neighborhood where everyone waved at each other from their porches, where children rode their bikes, and laughter filled the air during weekend barbecues. To any outsider, Greenwood Hills appeared to be a perfect, peaceful place to live. But as David Bennett stepped out of his car with his wife Lisa and their two children, he felt a slight tension. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but there was something about the way the neighbors across the street were watching. They weren't hostile stares, but they weren't exactly welcoming either. "Well, this is it," Lisa said, her voice carrying a note of excitement as she looked up at their new home, a charming two-story house with a large front porch. It was everything they had dreamed of: spacious, comfortable, and in a neighborhood known for good schools and family-friendly events. David smiled down at his wife, pushing aside the unease that lingered in his chest. "It's perfect," he agreed, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. Their daughter Alyssa was already darting toward the house, her long braids bouncing as she excitedly called for her younger brother, Kyle, to hurry up. "Come on, Kyle! I bet we have the biggest backyard!" Alyssa shouted, her face glowing with the joy that only a 12-year-old can truly express. Kyle, ever the quiet observer at 7 years old, followed more slowly, clutching his favorite action figure in one hand and glancing around curiously. As the children explored the house, David and Lisa began the process of unpacking. The first day was exhausting, but there was a sense of accomplishment in making their new house a home. By the time the sun was setting, they had managed to set up the kitchen and living room, and David had even fired up the grill for a quick family dinner. Later that evening, as the family sat on the back porch eating burgers and watching the sky turn shades of pink and purple, Lisa turned to David, her expression content but thoughtful. "I think we're going to love it here. It's a fresh start, you know. Just what we needed." David nodded, taking in the calm surroundings. "Yeah, it's going to be great." A few days later, David decided it was time to introduce themselves to the neighbors. Greenwood Hills was known for its community spirit, and he didn't want to be the family that kept to themselves. He and Lisa had always believed in building strong connections wherever they lived. The first neighbor they met was Jason Reynolds, a friendly man in his 40s with a perpetual grin and an easygoing demeanor. Jason had walked over the minute he saw David working in the yard, holding out his hand with a smile. "Hey, you must be the Bennetts," Jason said, his voice warm. "I'm Jason. My wife Sandra, and I live just 2 doors down. Welcome to Greenwood Hills." David shook his hand, feeling a bit more at ease. "Thanks, Jason. We're happy to be here. This neighborhood seems great." "It is," Jason replied. "A lot of good people here. We have block parties in the summer, barbecues. Everyone gets involved. You'll fit right in." David smiled, liking the sound of that. "That sounds awesome. We're actually thinking of hosting a barbecue ourselves once we settle in, get to know everyone." "You definitely should," Jason encouraged. "And let me know if you need help setting up. I can bring over some chairs or a cooler if you need." As they continued to chat, David felt his earlier tension begin to fade. Jason seemed genuine, and it was a relief to know that at least one neighbor was welcoming. But as they spoke, David noticed an older woman standing at the end of her driveway, watching them with a critical eye. "That's Nancy Harper," Jason said quietly, following David's gaze. "She's lived here forever. Nice enough, but, well, let's just say she likes things her way. Don't be surprised if she's a bit distant." David nodded, understanding the implication. Nancy didn't look unfriendly exactly, but there was a stiffness to her posture, a guardedness in her gaze. He decided to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she was just one of those people who took time to warm up to new faces. The next day, while Lisa was out planting flowers in the front yard, Nancy Harper approached. She wore a perfectly pressed blouse, slacks, and a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her silver hair was styled neatly, and she carried a small dog, one of those yappy, energetic terriers that seemed to bark at everything. "Good afternoon," Nancy said, her voice crisp. "Hello," Lisa replied cheerfully, wiping the dirt off her gloves. "You must be one of our neighbors. I'm Lisa Bennett." "Nancy Harper," the older woman said with a brief nod. "I've lived here for 40 years. Greenwood Hills has always been a traditional neighborhood. Lisa smiled, but she couldn't help but sense the undertone in Nancy's words. We're really excited to be here, Lisa said, keeping her tone warm. It seems like such a close-knit community. Nancy's eyes flicked to the flowers Lisa was planting. Those are pretty. You'll want to watch how much sun they get, though. This time of year, the weather can be unpredictable. Oh, thanks for the tip, Lisa said, still smiling. I'll keep an eye on them. There was a pause as Nancy took in the sight of Lisa's garden, her gaze sweeping over the Bennett home, as if she were appraising it. Well, Nancy said finally, adjusting her grip on the dog's leash. It's good to meet you, Mrs. Bennett. I'll see you around. With that, she turned and walked back toward her house, her back straight and her expression unreadable. As Lisa watched her go, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything Nancy had said directly, but there was a distinct coolness in her demeanor, as if she had already formed an opinion about the Bennetts before even getting to know them. That evening, Lisa told David about the encounter. I don't know, she said, stirring the pasta on the stove. She was polite, but there was something strange, like she doesn't really want us here. David frowned as he set the table. Jason did say she's a bit old-fashioned. Maybe she just needs time. Maybe, Lisa said, though her brow remained furrowed. I just hope it doesn't turn into a thing. Despite the initial awkwardness with Nancy, the Bennetts continued to settle into their new life in Greenwood Hills. Alyssa and Kyle started school, quickly making friends with some of the neighborhood kids, and Lisa found a nearby gym she liked. David's commute to his office was easier than expected, and overall, they were enjoying the peaceful atmosphere of the suburb. However, as the weeks passed, they couldn't help but notice a pattern. While Jason and a few other neighbors were friendly and open, some of the longer-term residents kept their distance. There were polite nods and brief hellos, but conversations remained short, and invitations to neighborhood events never came their way. One Saturday, while Lisa was running errands, David decided to take the kids to the park. Alyssa and Kyle were excited to play on the swings and jungle gym, and David brought a book to relax on a bench nearby. The park was full of families, but as David sat there, he couldn't help but notice Nancy Harper on the other side of the park, watching him with the same critical expression she had worn when they first moved in. He tried to ignore it, but when a small group of kids gathered around Kyle and Alyssa to play with them, David overheard something that made his chest tighten. One of the children, a little girl with bright blonde hair, pointed at Kyle and said, "My grandma says they don't belong here." Kyle, not understanding the weight of the words, just kept playing. But Alyssa looked up, her face flushed with confusion and hurt. She glanced back at David, who gave her a reassuring smile, but inside his frustration simmered. That night, as he lay in bed next to Lisa, David replayed the moment in his mind. He had never been one to let prejudice or ignorance get to him, but it was different now. This was his family, his children. And for the first time since moving into Greenwood Hills, he wondered if they had made the right choice. As the weeks passed, the Bennetts did their best to settle into life in Greenwood Hills, but the tension continued to simmer just beneath the surface. It wasn't just the cool demeanor of Nancy Harper or the occasional whispers David overheard at the park. It was the subtle ways the neighborhood seemed to be shutting them out. Despite the neighborhood being known for its active social calendar, Lisa realized they hadn't received a single invitation to any of the community events. There were neighborhood potlucks, movie nights, and even a weekend block party that took place right on their street, yet somehow no one had knocked on their door to invite them. The Bennetts weren't completely excluded. Some neighbors, like Jason Reynolds and his wife Sandra, made efforts to include them in small gatherings, but the sense of unease lingered. One afternoon, as David was mowing the lawn, he noticed Jason walking over, a six-pack of beer in his hand and a concerned look on his face. "Hey, man," Jason said, holding out a cold one. "Thought you could use this after all that work." David took the beer with a grateful nod, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "Thanks. It's been one of those days." Jason hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Look, I wanted to ask you something. Have you guys been feeling okay around here? You know, with the neighbors and all?" David paused, considering how to respond. Jason was one of the few people who had been welcoming from the start, and he didn't want to complain. But the weight of the isolation was hard to ignore. To be honest, it's been a little strange, David admitted. People are polite, but it feels like we're not really part of the community. We haven't been invited to anything, and, well, there's this underlying feeling that we don't quite belong. Jason nodded, looking uncomfortable but understanding. Yeah, I've noticed that too. Some folks around here are just set in their ways, especially the older crowd like Nancy Harper. She's been here forever, and let's just say she doesn't deal with change very well. David sighed, taking a long sip of the beer. I figured as much, but I didn't think it would be this hard to fit in. We're not trying to shake things up. We just want to be part of the neighborhood, you know? Jason clapped a hand on David's shoulder. I get it, man, and I'll do what I can to help. We've been thinking about throwing a little get-together ourselves, just a small group of neighbors. Maybe you guys could come, and it'll be a chance for people to get to know you better. David appreciated the gesture, but felt a pang of frustration. Thanks, Jason, but I don't want you to have to go out of your way. We were thinking of hosting a barbecue ourselves, something casual just to meet everyone. Maybe that'll help break the ice. Jason smiled. That sounds perfect. Let me know if you need any help with the setup. I've got a grill you can borrow if yours isn't big enough. David nodded, grateful for Jason's support. I'll let you know. We're planning it for next weekend, so hopefully things go smoothly. The following weekend, the Bennetts were busy preparing for the barbecue. Lisa spent hours cooking and organizing the food, while David set up tables and chairs in the backyard. Alyssa and Kyle helped by decorating the front porch with colorful streamers and setting up a small game area for the kids. The plan was simple: invite as many neighbors as possible, offer good food, and let the conversations flow naturally. They hoped it would be a chance for people to see them as part of the community, not as outsiders. Lisa printed out cheerful invitations and walked door to door with the kids to hand them out. Most of the neighbors were polite, some even friendly. But when they arrived at Nancy Harper's house, Lisa felt the familiar knot in her stomach. She rang the doorbell, holding the invitation in her hand, trying to keep her smile warm and genuine. Nancy opened the door, her expression unreadable as usual. Her small dog, Buttons, yapped loudly at Lisa's feet, but Nancy didn't make any effort to quiet him. Good afternoon, Mrs. Harper, Lisa began, her voice upbeat. We're hosting a barbecue this weekend and wanted to personally invite you. We thought it'd be a nice way to get to know everyone. Nancy glanced at the invitation, but didn't take it from Lisa's hand. A barbecue, you say? She said, her tone cool. I'm not sure I'll be able to attend. I have a busy weekend ahead. Lisa forced a smile. Of course, if you can make it, we'd love to have you. It's just a casual get-together. Nancy's lips thinned into a line. I'll think about it, she said, her voice clipped. But I wouldn't count on me being there. With that, she closed the door, leaving Lisa standing on the porch, the invitation still in her hand. As Lisa walked back to her house, Alyssa tugged at her sleeve. Why doesn't Mrs. Harper like us, Mom? She asked, her brow furrowed with confusion. Lisa sighed, putting an arm around her daughter's shoulders. Some people take time to warm up to new things, sweetie. It's not about liking or not liking. It's just the way some people are. But deep down, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. The barbecue started off well enough. A few neighbors arrived early, including Jason and Sandra, who brought over extra lawn chairs and a cooler full of drinks. The smell of grilled burgers and hot dogs filled the air, and kids ran around the backyard playing games. For a while, it seemed like everything was going according to plan. Conversations flowed, and although some neighbors kept their distance, the mood was light and friendly. David manned the grill while Lisa made sure everyone had enough to eat. Alyssa and Kyle were laughing with the other kids, and for the first time, it felt like they might finally be breaking through the invisible wall that had kept them on the fringes. But as the evening wore on, Lisa noticed a few neighbors whispering among themselves. She couldn't hear exactly what was being said, but there was an uncomfortable energy in the air. Then, just as David was serving the last round of burgers, a police car pulled up in front of the house, its lights flashing. The entire barbecue seemed to freeze. Neighbors exchanged glances, and the children stopped playing, their eyes wide with confusion. David's face tightened as he set down the spatula. He walked over to the front yard, where two officers were stepping out of their vehicle. "Evening, officers," David said, keeping his tone steady. "Is there a problem?" The officers glanced around, clearly taken aback by the calm atmosphere of the gathering. One of them cleared his throat. "We received a noise complaint," he explained, his tone polite but firm. "Someone called about loud music and possible suspicious activity." David's jaw clenched. He knew exactly what this was about. "As you can see, we're just having a barbecue. Nothing suspicious going on here." The officer nodded, looking around at the quiet gathering of neighbors. "It doesn't seem like there's anything out of the ordinary," he admitted, "but we'll need to check things out, just to be thorough." David stepped aside, letting the officers walk into the backyard. The mood had shifted completely. What had been a lively, friendly event was now filled with tension. Lisa stood by the grill, her hands wringing together nervously as the officers made their way through the yard, talking quietly to a few of the guests. When they finally returned to the front yard, the lead officer gave David an apologetic look. "Sorry for the inconvenience, sir. Everything seems to be in order here. We'll go ahead and clear the call." David nodded, keeping his voice calm. "No problem, officers. Thanks for checking in." As the police drove away, the neighbors slowly began to disperse. The atmosphere had been ruined. Lisa walked up to David, her face pale with disbelief. "I can't believe someone called the police on us." David sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I can. It's pretty clear that not everyone wants us here." They both glanced across the street at Nancy Harper's house. Her porch light was on, but the curtains were drawn. David didn't need to see her face to know who had made the call. This segment brings the story to its first emotional peak, with the Bennetts facing their first direct confrontation in the form of the police call. The tension rises as they realize that some neighbors may never fully accept them. Leading the days following the barbecue were tense. Word of the police call spread quickly through the neighborhood, and while no one openly confronted the Bennetts, there was an undeniable shift in the atmosphere. Neighbors who had been polite before now seemed distant. When David and Lisa took walks around the block, they noticed how some people avoided eye contact or quickly closed their doors as they passed by. Even Alyssa and Kyle sensed the change. The neighborhood kids who had once played with them now seemed hesitant, as if something had shifted overnight. David's frustration was mounting. Every morning he left the house for work, feeling a growing sense of resentment. He had worked hard to provide his family with a good life, and here they were, in a supposedly safe and friendly neighborhood, being treated like outsiders. One evening, David sat on the back porch, his face tight with frustration, while Lisa poured herself a cup of tea and joined him. The silence between them was heavy. "I don't know how much more of this I can take," David finally said, his voice low but filled with tension. "We've done nothing but try to be a part of this community, and look how we're treated." Lisa sighed, setting her cup down on the table. "I know, but we can't just leave. We've invested too much in this house, and the kids are finally starting to adjust to their new schools. We have to figure out how to deal with this." David leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "It's just, no matter what we do, they'll always see us as different." That call to the police wasn't just about noise. Someone wanted to send a message. Lisa placed a hand on his arm, her voice soft but firm. "Then we'll send a message back. We'll keep doing what we're doing. We can't let a few people make us feel like we don't belong here. This is our home now." The following weeks were a difficult time for the Bennett family. Lisa continued to try and stay optimistic, but it was hard not to feel the isolation. Every day she noticed little things, the way some neighbors would turn their backs when she waved, or how invitations to community events never seemed to reach their mailbox. She tried to stay positive for the sake of Alyssa and Kyle, but it was clear that even the kids were feeling the strain. At school, Alyssa was no longer invited to the sleepovers and birthday parties of the neighborhood girls. Kyle, who had always been a bit shy, found it harder to make friends now that the other kids seemed to whisper and point at him when he wasn't looking. The hurt in their eyes broke Lisa's heart, but she didn't know how to fix it. One evening, Lisa was at the grocery store picking up ingredients for dinner when she overheard two women talking in the next aisle. She couldn't see their faces, but their voices were unmistakable. One of them was Nancy Harper. "I just don't understand why they're even here," Nancy was saying, her voice low but filled with disdain. This neighborhood has always been a certain way, and now it's changing. I'm not saying anything against them personally, but it's just not the same. The other woman, who Lisa recognized as Margaret Hill, a longtime resident, nodded. I know what you mean. Things are different now. I don't like it either, but what can we do? They're not breaking any rules. Nancy huffed. Rules or not, they don't belong here. We've worked hard to keep this community the way it is, and now look at what's happening. It's not just them. It's everything that's coming with them. Lisa felt her stomach tighten, the sting of their words hitting her like a punch. She quickly finished her shopping and left the store, her hands trembling as she loaded the groceries into the car. As she drove home, she wondered how much more they would have to endure before things got better, or if they ever would. One afternoon a few days later, David came home to find Jason Reynolds waiting on his porch. Jason looked uncomfortable, as if he had something weighing on his mind. Hey, David, Jason said, his voice hesitant. Can we talk for a minute? David nodded, motioning for him to sit down. What's on your mind? Jason scratched the back of his neck, clearly struggling with what he wanted to say. Look, I've been hearing some things around the neighborhood. People are talking and I hate to say it, but it's not good. Nancy Harper's been stirring up a lot of trouble, and it's affecting how some of the others see you guys. David clenched his fist but kept his voice calm. Yeah, we've noticed. Jason sighed, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. It's not right. You and your family don't deserve this. I've been talking to some of the other neighbors, people like us, who don't buy into all that nonsense. And we're thinking of organizing a neighborhood meeting. Maybe if we get everyone together, we can clear the air and stop this thing from getting worse. David raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. You really think that'll work? Nancy's been here forever, and it's pretty clear a lot of people listen to her. Jason shrugged. Maybe, but I think it's worth a shot. We can't just sit back and let things keep going like this. You guys deserve to feel welcome here, and the only way we're going to fix that is if we confront the issue head on. David sat back, considering the idea. Part of him wanted to avoid stirring the pot any further, but another part of him knew that if they didn't stand up now, things would only get worse. All right, David said finally. Let's do it. Let's see if we can get this neighborhood to listen. The meeting was scheduled for the following weekend at the local recreation center. Jason had worked tirelessly to get as many people to attend as possible, sending out flyers and personally inviting neighbors. David was nervous, unsure of how the evening would play out. But Lisa was supportive, reminding him that this was their chance to speak up and address the underlying tensions in the community. On the day of the meeting, David and Lisa arrived early to help set up chairs and make sure everything was ready. Slowly, the room began to fill with neighbors. Some, like Jason and his wife Sandra, offered warm greetings. Others, like Nancy Harper, sat in the back, arms crossed, their faces unreadable. When it was time to start, Jason stood at the front of the room and cleared his throat. Thank you all for coming tonight. We've got some important things to talk about, and I hope we can all be open and honest with each other. He turned to David, who took a deep breath before stepping forward. Most of you know me, David began, his voice steady but tense. My name is David Bennett, and my family and I moved to Greenwood Hills a few months ago. We came here because we wanted a safe, friendly place to raise our kids. But it's become pretty clear that not everyone feels the same way about us being here. There was a murmur in the crowd, but David continued. We've done nothing but try to be good neighbors. We've gone out of our way to meet people, host events, and be part of this community. But some of you have made it clear, whether through gossip or by calling the police on us, that you don't want us here. Nancy Harper shifted in her seat, her face tightening. David met her gaze unflinching. I'm not here to point fingers or stir up trouble. I'm here because my family deserves the same respect and acceptance as anyone else in this neighborhood. And if we're going to live here, we need to clear the air. The room was silent for a moment before one of the other neighbors, Betty Shaw, a retired teacher, raised her hand. I think it's time we acknowledge that things have changed in Greenwood Hills. This is a different world than the one it used to be, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I've known Nancy for years, and I know she means well, but we all need to realize that our community is only as strong as the people who make it up. Betty Shaw's words hung in the air, creating a ripple of murmurs among the crowd. Her calm, measured tone seemed to resonate with some of the neighbors, but others, like Nancy Harper, remained stone-faced. David watched as several people exchanged glances, as if they were deciding whether or not to agree with Betty's statement. David took a deep breath and continued. We're not asking for special treatment. We're asking to be treated the same as anyone else here. We want our kids to feel safe, to make friends, and to grow up in a place where they're not judged by anything other than who they are. Jason nodded in agreement and stood beside David. I think David's right. We all want the same things: safety, community, and a sense of belonging. But we can't get there if we keep letting old habits and prejudices divide us. Greenwood Hills has always been a great neighborhood because of its strong community, and we need to make sure that everyone, including the Bennetts, feels like they're a part of that. Another neighbor, Mr. Ramirez, who had lived in Greenwood Hills for over a decade, spoke up. Look, I'll admit that I've been cautious. Maybe some of us have been slow to warm up, but I've seen nothing but kindness from the Bennetts. Maybe it's time we start judging people on how they act, not what we think they represent. There were nods from a few others in the crowd. David could feel the tension beginning to shift slightly. However, Nancy Harper's face remained impassive, her lips pursed tightly as though she was holding back words. Finally, Nancy stood, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them in front of her. I'm sorry, she said, her voice tight with emotion. I'm sorry if people think I've been unwelcoming. That's not what I meant. But this neighborhood was different. It's always been a place where we knew everyone, where things stayed the same. Now everything is changing, and I'm not sure how to handle it. Lisa, who had been sitting quietly beside David, stood up and addressed Nancy directly. I understand change can be hard, Mrs. Harper. It's scary sometimes. But we're not here to take anything away from you or the neighborhood. We want to contribute, to help make this place even better. We're not so different from you. We want to be good neighbors just like you do. Nancy's gaze softened ever so slightly and she nodded, though the tightness in her expression remained. Maybe I haven't been as fair as I should have been, she admitted. I suppose it's hard for me to see the good in change when all I see are things slipping away. Betty, sensing the moment was crucial, added gently, None of us are perfect, Nancy. But we can't cling to the past forever. We have to move forward and embrace the people who want to be part of our lives. The room was silent again as Nancy stood, deep in thought. Her face softened, just a bit, and she looked at David and Lisa with something that almost resembled regret. I'll try, she said quietly. I'll try to see things differently. Though the community meeting had opened the door for dialogue, things didn't change overnight. There were still cold stares and whispered conversations from a few holdouts, but David and Lisa felt a glimmer of hope. Slowly, a few more neighbors began to approach them, offering small gestures of friendship, a smile here, a nod there. A few weeks after the meeting, something happened that would change everything. It was late October, and a powerful storm swept through Greenwood Hills. The wind howled through the trees and rain pounded against windows. In the middle of the night, a loud crash echoed through the neighborhood, waking David and Lisa from their sleep. What was that? Lisa asked, sitting up in bed, her heart racing. David jumped out of bed and rushed to the window. He could barely see through the rain, but in the distance he saw a large tree had fallen across the street, right onto Nancy Harper's house. Oh my God, Lisa whispered, joining him at the window. We have to check on her. Without a second thought, David threw on his raincoat and ran out the door, Lisa close behind him. The wind whipped at their faces as they dashed across the street to Nancy's house. The tree had crushed part of the roof, and debris littered the yard. David pounded on Nancy's door, shouting her name. After a few tense moments, the door creaked open, and there stood Nancy, her face pale and her body shaking. Are you okay? David asked urgently. Is anyone else in the house? Nancy shook her head, her voice barely audible. I'm fine, just scared. David and Lisa quickly assessed the damage, and it was clear that Nancy couldn't stay in the house that night. You can't stay here, Lisa said, her voice firm but gentle. Come stay with us until we figure this out. Nancy hesitated for a moment, her pride keeping her from accepting help, but another loud crack of thunder shook the house, and she relented. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaky. "I don't know what to do." Back at the Bennett's house, Nancy sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea Lisa had made for her. The tension between the families seemed to dissolve in the warm glow of the kitchen light. Nancy looked around the room, her eyes lingering on family photos of David, Lisa, Alyssa, and Kyle, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "I didn't expect this," Nancy said softly, breaking the silence. "I didn't expect kindness from you. Not after the way I've treated your family." David sat across from her, his expression gentle but firm. "We're all human, Mrs. Harper. We all make mistakes, but it's never too late to make things right." Nancy stared into her cup, her voice quivering with vulnerability. "I've been so scared of losing everything I've known. My home, my sense of belonging. When I saw things changing around me, I felt powerless." Lisa reached across the table and gently touched Nancy's hand. "Change doesn't have to be bad, Nancy. You're not losing anything. You're gaining a community that can grow and be even stronger. We want to be a part of that, but we can't do it alone." Nancy blinked, tears welling in her eyes. For the first time, she allowed herself to see the Bennetts not as outsiders, but as people, good people who had only ever wanted to belong. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I've been wrong about you." David smiled softly. "We all have things to learn, Mrs. Harper. What matters is that we keep trying." Word of David and Lisa's actions during the storm spread quickly through the neighborhood. Neighbors who had been on the fence about the Bennetts began to see them in a new light. Even those who had been distant started to soften. The storm, while destructive, had brought a kind of clarity to Greenwood Hills. A reminder that community wasn't about who had been there the longest, but about how people came together in times of need. Nancy Harper, once the staunch gatekeeper of the old neighborhood, began to change. She became more involved in community events, joining in where she had once held back. She even invited the Bennetts over for tea one afternoon, a quiet gesture of reconciliation that meant more to David and Lisa than she could ever know. The Bennetts, too, found their place in Greenwood Hills. David became active in the neighborhood association, helping to organize events that brought people together. Lisa started a community garden project that encouraged neighbors to work side by side, growing vegetables, flowers, and friendships. As the weeks turned into months, the Bennetts no longer felt like outsiders. They were part of the fabric of Greenwood Hills, a neighborhood that had grown and evolved in ways that no one could have predicted. The bonds that had once been strained now held strong, and the future of the community seemed brighter than ever. In the aftermath of the storm and Nancy Harper's quiet reconciliation with the Bennetts, the entire atmosphere in Greenwood Hills seemed to shift. It wasn't immediate, but little by little, the invisible walls that had once kept David and Lisa on the outside began to crumble. Neighbors who had once only offered polite nods or brief hellos started to engage more. Invitations to block parties and community events finally began to appear in their mailbox. The neighborhood's transformation wasn't just because of one event. It was the result of many small actions that slowly knit the community back together. One of those moments came during a town meeting just a month after the storm. David had been hesitant about attending. After all, he had made his point at the last meeting, and while some neighbors had responded well, he didn't expect too much change in the long term. But Jason convinced him to go, telling him that it was an important gathering, one that could potentially help solidify the progress they'd made. The room at the recreation center was packed. People stood chatting in small groups, but the mood was different this time. There was more energy, a sense of openness that hadn't been there before. When the meeting officially started, Betty Shaw, who had taken on a leadership role in the community association, stood at the front of the room and cleared her throat to get everyone's attention. "We've had some hard times recently," Betty began, her voice steady. "We've been challenged as a neighborhood, but I think we've also been given an opportunity, a chance to come together in ways we hadn't before." She gestured to David, who was sitting in the front row. David Bennett, along with his family, has been an example of what it means to be part of a community, even when that community hasn't always been kind to them. I think it's time we officially recognize the positive changes that they've brought to Greenwood Hills. The applause started slowly, but within moments it filled the room. David felt a rush of warmth in his chest as he stood, nodding his thanks to the neighbors around him. It was a moment of validation, proof that his family's perseverance had paid off. Betty continued, smiling at the room. We've also got a new project coming up, one that I think will bring all of us closer together. David and Lisa Bennett have agreed to spearhead a community garden project. It'll be a space where anyone in the neighborhood can grow their own vegetables and flowers, and it'll give us all a chance to work side by side. The crowd murmured excitedly. The idea of a community garden had been discussed before, but it hadn't gained much traction. Now, with the Bennetts leading the charge, it seemed like the perfect way to continue the healing process that had already begun. The next few months were a whirlwind of planning, organizing, and preparing the land for the community garden. David, Lisa, and Jason worked tirelessly to rally volunteers, gather supplies, and reach out to local businesses for donations of tools and plants. To their surprise, Nancy Harper was one of the first to offer her help, showing up with gardening gloves and a determined expression. I may not know much about planting, Nancy said with a wry smile, but I can certainly help with pulling weeds and making sure things are organized. Lisa smiled warmly at her. We're happy to have you, Nancy. Every bit helps. Over the next several weekends, the neighbors of Greenwood Hills came together to clear a plot of land in the local park. Families, children, and even older residents like Betty and Nancy pitched in. The work was hard, but the camaraderie made it feel like less of a chore. Slowly, the garden began to take shape, with raised beds for vegetables, a small herb section, and a flower garden that brightened up the space. For Lisa, the garden became more than just a project. It was a symbol of hope. Watching the neighbors, who had once kept their distance, now working side by side, laughing and sharing stories, filled her with a deep sense of pride. Alyssa and Kyle were there too, eagerly helping to plant seeds and water the flowers, their faces glowing with excitement. On one of the last work days, David stood back and took in the scene, children running around, their hands covered in dirt. Jason showing a group of volunteers how to build trellises for climbing plants, and Lisa laughing with Nancy as they organized the tools. This was what he had always wanted, a community that not only accepted them, but embraced them. By late summer, the garden was in full bloom. Vegetables sprouted from the earth, flowers blossomed, and the air was filled with the scent of fresh herbs. The neighbors decided to host a harvest festival to celebrate the garden's success. The event would feature food, music, and stalls where neighbors could sell or trade their homegrown produce. The festival day was perfect, with the sun shining brightly and a cool breeze drifting through the park. Tables were set up, and each was covered with colorful displays of vegetables, homemade jams, and flower bouquets. A local band played soft music in the background, and children raced around, their laughter filling the air. David and Lisa stood at the center of it all, watching with pride as neighbors from all walks of life came together. Nancy Harper, who had once been the face of resistance in the neighborhood, was now sitting at a booth selling fresh herbs she'd grown herself. She smiled at everyone who passed by and even waved to Lisa when their eyes met. The Bennett's children, Alyssa and Kyle, were playing with other kids, their joy contagious. They had finally found their place in the neighborhood, and it showed in every giggle and every game they played. As the festival continued, Betty Shaw stood up and made a short speech, her voice filled with warmth and pride. This garden is proof that when people come together, amazing things can happen. We've been through a lot as a neighborhood, but we're stronger for it. And I think we all owe a huge thank you to David, Lisa, and their family for leading the way. The applause was loud and genuine. David and Lisa exchanged a smile, their hearts full. This moment, the celebration, the community, the friendships, was everything they had hoped for when they moved to Greenwood Hills. As the years passed, Greenwood Hills continued to thrive. The community garden became a central part of the neighborhood, not just for growing food, but for growing friendships. David and Lisa remained active in the neighborhood association, organizing events and encouraging others to get involved. They had found their place not just in Greenwood Hills, but in the hearts of the people who lived there. Nancy Harper, once the antagonist in their story, became one of their closest allies. She had transformed in ways no one expected, becoming a vocal supporter of inclusivity and community engagement. She often reflected on how the Bennetts had taught her the value of kindness, understanding, and embracing change. For David and Lisa, the journey had been long and difficult, but it was worth every struggle. Their children had grown up in a neighborhood that had once seemed hostile, but now felt like home. Greenwood Hills had become more than just a place to live. It had become a true community, bound together by the strength of its people. As they stood in their garden, watching the sunset over the colorful blooms, David wrapped his arm around Lisa's shoulders. "We did it," he said softly. "We made this place our home." Lisa smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "We didn't just make a home," she whispered. "We built a community." And in that moment, surrounded by the fruits of their labor and the love of their neighbors, they knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they had already won.